welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you with us. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I'm serving a church in the Pacific Northwest, location undisclosed. Actually, it's in Vancouver, Washington, suburb of Portland. And I'm a writer. I write both fiction and nonfiction. I've been a professor of philosophy. I've even done some other things. I've been a real estate investor and a building contractor. But anyway, enough about me. Why don't we run around the horn, as they say in baseball, and introduce the other guys, or have the other guys introduce themselves. So, Tom, tell us about yourself.
Tom Price, teach systematic theology, Christian ethics, philosophy, a few other things at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and other places.
And Glenn.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a professor emeritus of history at Central Connecticut State University. That means I'm retired from that. I'm also a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and I'm working at Reflections Ministries with Ken Boa.
Excellent. Great stuff. Hey, before we jump into the subject of the day, I want to take an opportunity or take a moment to talk a little bit about the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network and the big conference coming up in Nashville. I think this show will be out just maybe a week or two before, or maybe a little more, maybe 3 weeks or so before that big event. If you've been on the fence with regard to attending that event, let me just say, jump off the fence on the right side of history, on the right side of the fence, which is going. You know, it'd be great to see you there. We're going to be actually doing a live show at the conference. There are going to be some great speakers. Of course, Doug Wilson will be there, and Vodi Bakum will be there. Doug Tenapel will be there, and a lot of other people worthwhile, in terms of listening to them and learning from them. So anyway, with that in mind, if you want to learn more about the Fight, Laugh, Feast conference in the Nashville area, you can go to their website, the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network website, and learn about it there. Anyway, that's enough of that. So today, let's jump into the subject of the day, and it's my day. It's my day to pick the theme and introduce what we're talking about. Let me. I want to react to something that I saw the Intercollegiate Studies Institute published a number of years ago, back in 2010, by Larry Arnhart, and it struck me as unusual because, generally speaking, I find myself agreeing with the stuff that I see ISI, publishing. But here I found myself challenged, and in the sense that, there was an article that I found myself at a very fundamental level disagreeing with. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't have published it. That's not my point. It's just that the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, generally speaking, publishes articles that are very much in sort of harmony with the Christendom and the Judeo-Christian tradition in the West. And this particular article was really not in sort of keeping with their history of publishing. And the title of the article is Darwinian Conservatism versus Metaphysical Conservatism. And we'll put a link to the article in the show notes. Larry Arnhart is a professor, or was a professor, of political science at Northern Illinois University. He's an emeritus, but he was an emeritus back in 2010. And I don't know much about him apart from what I, just read in terms of his byline and this article. When I first saw the article, because it was published by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, I thought it was going to be sort of a takedown of Darwinian conservatism and a vindication of metaphysical conservatism. But how wrong I was. It's actually the reverse. This is a defense
How
of Darwinian.
disappointed.
That's right. This is a defense of Darwinian conservatism. Now, for the grumblers out there in Pugcast land, this might be just a non sequitur. Darwinian conservatism, in terms of their, the personal experience of a lot of people. People who have embraced Darwin often are on the political left. And so this might just seem odd that a person who is a Darwinist could be a conservative. But there actually is a fairly lively and broad-based group of people who identify themselves as, people who are on board with Darwin, and they're conservative, and they actually think that Darwin's theories actually are kind of can be used to actually support a conservative political and social agenda. And so what I want to do is I want to look at the arguments, and I want to say before we get into any of the arguments, this particular subject is often addressed from the standpoint of the science or the disputed science. People often talk about the age of the Earth, or they try to think about whether or not particular fossils actually are indicate what people say they indicate and stuff like that. Just so you folks out there in Pugcast land understand what we're up to, we're not going to go to any of those places. If you want answers in Genesis, you can go to Answers in Genesis. we're not going to get into that kind of conversation. We're more interested in the philosophy, and we're interested in some of the connections that Larry Arnhart is making, and some of his critiques of metaphysical conservatism, and why we think that he's not really being fair to metaphysical conservatism or representing it well. Even when you disagree with something, you really ought to make sure that you do a good job of representing what you disagree with, and we don't think he did. So anyway, that's the nature of the conversation. Now you guys had a chance to read a little bit from this article, or read a little bit of it. We're not going to go into the very last section where he talks about the subject of slavery. He's using that, I think, to sort of grind his axes or whatever. We don't need to go there. There's plenty to react to, before you get to that. But since you've had a chance to read it, do you have any quick thoughts based on what you did read? Maybe criticisms or even things that you think he did well.
Glenn, you want to start?
Yeah, well, I just found a certain number of his statements seem to be incoherent. An example is he talks about natural teleology. I don't know how you have natural teleology without design or some sort of intended trajectory. I just don't see how you get there.
Right.
From Darwinism.
Yeah,
he made a couple of interesting points about people being, for example, one of the things that evolutionary perspectives can help with in conservatism is the idea that people are inherently imperfect.
Right.
So that's a good point. But on the other hand, since we're always in flux and mutating into something different, that can undermine the whole point. I mean, so there were a number of things like that just struck me as being, like I said, incoherent. I'm not sure how they hang together in his mind.
Yeah, I'm going to read a statement or two in a minute after Tom's had a chance to react, to kind of help people understand kind of the argument that Darwinian conservatives make. But those are good points. Go ahead, Tom. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, following Glenn, just even the notion of measuring something as perfect and imperfect, based on what? I mean, right. If you're just talking about in terms of something, I mean, are we talking morally here? That's a whole different set of things than talking about the functions of our material natures, right? Whether they're functioning in terms of what would be projected better or not based on environment and sustaining. But I think a point just up front for a lot of people is, as Chris and you had mentioned in some previous conversations about this, a lot of non sequiturs. And I think even the title itself is kind of one of those, because what he's doing is positing something, the language of which is Darwinian kind of conservatism versus metaphysical conservatism. And I think just by stating that, there is something that gets eclipsed. It's that what we have is two differing metaphysics. We don't. This is just
Yeah.
classical. This is just classical theism in some sense of the word versus naturalism or materialism or physicalism. That's really what's going on here, and he's just clouding it in one particular interpretation of a naturalistic a metaphysic that he would find agreeable towards his conservative inclinations.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, Tom. I think that sometimes these folks beg the question, and one of the ways they beg the question when they're advocating, what they present as the science versus your philosophy or whatever, is that it's possible not to have a metaphysic. In other words, you have a metaphysic, Tom, but I don't. I'm just going with the science. I'm just, but no metaphysic is a metaphysic. It's the metaphysics of zero, and it has a number of implications for, ethics and politics and lots of other things. But I think that's right. I mean, there is no such thing as somebody who doesn't have a metaphysic. You can be a naturalist. That's your metaphysic, But what I want to do here is just read maybe two or three statements that help us to understand what he's promoting. What is Darwinian conservatism, or at least, what he says is Darwinian conservatism. So he says here on the first page, I have said that conservatives need Charles Darwin because a Darwinian science of human evolution supports the conservative view of human imperfectibility and the conservative commitment to ordered liberty as rooted in natural desires, customary traditions, and prudential judgments. For a society of ordered liberty to succeed, I have argued elsewhere, it must satisfy the desires of human nature as shaped by genetic evolution. It must have sustained by the customs of human history as shaped by cultural evolution, and it must be promoted by the judgments of human reason as shaped by prudential deliberation. Now, there are a whole lot of things that he's importing here that we should probably help to take apart. But that's what he says, is Darwinian conservatism. He goes on to describe it in some other ways. Says, as he's trying to elaborate on this, he says, contingencies of cultural history and individual temperament are so variable that we need prudence to judge what is best for particular societies and particular individuals in specific circumstances. No argument with that. A Darwinian conservatism can generalize, however, that ordered liberty will always require the moral order of traditional morality, the social order of family life, the economic order of private property, and the political order of limited government. A Darwinian science of evolution shows how such a conception of ordered liberty conforms to the evolved nature of human beings. Now, again, there's a lot there that we can take apart.
But basically what he just said is Darwin supports that there is an intrinsic moral, ethical, and teleological order. That's right. What he's trying to suggest. But he's taking classical grounding and the infinite source of everything, which determines everything, and basically implanting it into the process of nature.
Yeah. So let me go back here to. Go ahead, Glenn.
I know Marxists who would say that Darwinian evolution naturally leads you to Marxism.
Right.
Prove your point. I mean, you can't just sort of assert that and have it hang there. You have to show how these things follow from Darwin, and they don't.
Yeah.
And one last quick before I forget. I don't want to take your point, but if you noticed in his language too, is he's importing the Platonic Augustinian notion of desires that need to be ordered in order to flourish, and also be ordered towards some teleology, something almost a formal and final cause.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. He talks later about being able to think about ends from within an immanent frame naturally, in terms of natural order or a natural sort of environment. But we'll get into that in a minute. But I'd cut you off, Glenn.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we often forget when we're talking about Darwinism is it doesn't really have to do with interspecies competition. It has to do with competition within the species, which raises a host of questions about I understand you can make an argument that cooperation works better and all of that kind of thing. Okay, maybe. But it also sort of ignores Darwin's statements in The Descent of Man that, quote, the civilized races will inevitably exterminate the uncivilized races, meaning the whites are going to exterminate everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are lots of ways
this is explicit in Darwin.
Right.
So how does he get there from Darwin?
Yeah, there are lots of ways that contemporary thinkers kind of filter 19th century thinkers. We could say a lot of things that are really, ugly that, were said by Nietzsche as well and other people in the 19th century that probably at the time people didn't even blink when they heard those statements. But now we look back on them and say, well, that was crazy. But except given the fact that competition occurs within the species, it is the logic. Darwin was just taking his stuff to the logical conclusion. Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Right. Now, let me just add a few more things or a few more statements from this author, just to kind of round out, his argument. So he says a little further along, the Darwinian conservative assumes that we can fully understand human beings as products of natural evolution, so that we can base our moral and political reasoning on evolved human nature as we know it by common human experience. But many conservatives reject such a naturalistic view of human beings as a threat to any healthy cultural order. They believe such scientific naturalism cannot support a religiously grounded cosmic teleology in which human social order is judged by how well it conforms to the sacred order of the Creator. So now he's created his dichotomy. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got people who kind of reason up from observation and experience, and based on observation and experience can identify human nature and evolved human nature, that's his term. And then you have another group of people who religiously ground a cosmic teleology, apparently without any sort of other basis than perhaps revelation to do that by. And so it's implied, I think, that there's a kind of irrational sort, or he I think implies that there's an irrationality in a sense to this religiously grounded cosmic teleology, or at least that it is impossible to harmonize with things that we experience and observe, in the course of, our lives and as communities sort of are reflecting upon their histories.
And maybe there's a kind of thinking in terms of parsimony, in the sense that for him, I think his argument is we don't need to do a transcendently grounded ethic or moral order or that, because Darwin can give us those things and we should be happy with that. We don't need to go to further explanations other than the natural to account for these things. But of course, I mean, that is all fine and good if the first metaphysical issue is resolved, which is that naturalism itself is even intellectually plausible, much less a fairy tale, which I think it is, because you really these are your options, and I'm going to just I'm going to reduce a lot of metaphysics to something very simple. You either have a necessary being that has to have the classical attributes of God in order for there to be anything at all, or there's nothing. And what they try to do is basically just call that necessary being nature instead of God. And of course, they want to take the personal and the rational out, or the supranatural, because they're thinking we mean by supernatural that we're talking about a kind of supreme natural explanation. That's what they think. So we don't need a supernatural explanation if we have a natural explanation. But it never occurs to them that what classical metaphysics is talking about is not a supreme natural explanation or something explaining why nature. It's the whole other way around. What we're talking about is the issue of there being nature at all.
Right.
There is no nature unless it's the source that it is being itself. And everything about nature is that the natural isn't being. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to get into all the metaphysical layers, but that we're talking about the conditions for the possibility of there being nature at all. Nature isn't a self-explanatory metaphysical reality. And the only way it could be is if you import, which he sounds like he's trying to do, and immanentize the classical attributes of God as the self-existent one, which is the source of everything else. And so there's a long debate, which I can't go into here, of why nature can't be that and why it has to be a transcendent source. But so step one, so the reason metaphysical conservatives would reject a Darwinian explanation or natural Darwinian conservatism is that first metaphysical principle, it doesn't allow us to account for nature itself. Just positing nature and not characterizing why nature is, how it can be. See, what they do is they assume it is a given, but it's not something that tells us it can be in and of itself because it is being itself, because it's not. It's nature being. So anyway, I don't want to get into all that abstract stuff. But point one...
I think this is the key point. I think that he misrepresents the nature of metaphysical reflection. You know, what you've done here, Tom, is you've taken us back to sort of, okay, why is there an is? That's the question. Why is there anything at all? And that's just not even on the radar with this guy.
And the follow-up question to that then is the next one. He is assuming then, that when we talk about design and teleology, that we're thinking that it has to be something that is not intrinsic to the natural. And here's a great quote by Dave Bentley Hart in his book, The Experience of God, which I think is, before David went crazy, this was his, one of his best books.
There's going to be someday they'll look back and say there was the insane David Bentley Hart, and then there was the early David Bentley Hart.
And there's the one went over into the abyss he fought so hard. But
they may go with the documentary hypothesis and say there were two David Bentley.
That's right. I think that's the better. But he talks about, he goes, when we're talking about design and nature, classical theological arguments, when they're talking about the order of the world, are not talking about little fragments of design. That God's creative power can be seen in the whole rational coherence of nature as a perfect whole. And so that the universe was not simply the factitious product of a supreme intellect, but the unfolding of the omnipresent divine wisdom or logos, which is at the heart of all being. And so for Thomas Aquinas, God creates the order of nature by infusing things of the universe with the wonderful power of moving themselves towards determinate ends. So there is no dichotomy between transcendent source of all things and there being intrinsic teleology within kinds unfolding according to the determinative ends given to them by the Creator. So he's working with also a second false dichotomy between natural order and teleology and the need for it to be grounded in an immanent rather than transcendent source.
Yeah, at the very end of his treatment, of the contrasts between, a metaphysical conservatism and a Darwinian conservatism, he says this: a Darwinian science of human nature sustains the tradition of Aristotelian natural right and Thomistic natural law. As I was reading the article, I was saying to myself all the way along, your whole approach fails to give any kind of space to the Aristotelian and Thomistic ways of thinking about these things, and then at the very end he slips that in. I think it's maybe an afterthought, or maybe to cover himself. I don't know.
No, There's another issue here as well. I've always argued that metaphysics has to be primary for philosophy, but my tendency is always to go to epistemology. And when you look at Plantinga, C.S. Lewis, and actually I've come up with my own version of this. You can't
Sunshineism? Is this sunshineism?
You can't. Well, no. The point is, you can't get to rationality from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah.
There is no way. It's another one of these. You can't get there from here.
Right.
So he's arguing that our rationality can look at the world and look at evolved human nature and all of that sort of thing and reach conclusions. But the fact of the matter is, there's no basis for trusting your rationality on anything, if on an evolutionary model.
Yeah, he actually says something that just sort of like made my hair stand up. That actually it reflects you just noted here, Glenn. He says near the end of his section on let's see, what is it? Metaphysics, Evolution, and Teleology. Near the end of that, he says, even if evolution by natural selection is not purposeful. Okay, so he concedes that's what evolution is actually, on its own terms, all about. It's a purposeless, sort of process. There is no telos. Then he says, it produces organic beings that are purposeful. Now, but that's the whole point. This inconsistency or this. So either human beings or actually any creature that's an agent is somehow an anomaly in the larger order of things. In other words, something something intelligent has emerged out of things that are, by their very nature, uninformed, unintelligent, just stuff. Or there's something wrong with this whole way of thinking about things. And this is what you're getting at, Tom, and this is what, of course, this whole approach that we've been talking about in terms of the inherent rationality of creation itself, of reality, reflects.
That's right.
Words,
reality being rational at all is another is something. Naturalism is a guiding prejudice. That's all it is. It can't count for itself in its own terms. You need a metaphysical explanation for nature to be. Period. That is moving beyond the natural. You are already offering an argument that cannot be tested, cannot be checked, cannot be understood by the senses. And so if you have that as your beginning point, which you can't get off the ground, the rest of it's nothing. It's just the reason it's incoherent is because it's having to take everything from the classic Christian vision and just immanentize it with the magic wand that nature somehow just has all this potential. And there's no explanation for why there is anything at all, much less actuality, much less potential to be actualized. So it really is fantasy thinking. And so it's just one of those. I mean, I'm glad as a Darwinian, he wants to admit what we've been saying all along, that there is a rational cosmos, that it is ordered morally, and that there are things that match pretty much what Genesis taught us, that there are orders of creation like family and procreation and labor and all these things that are for the sustaining and flourishing. But just by merely reading them off the surface of nature, as if that is going to explain all that begs the question on a Darwinian explanation, not on a theistic one.
Well, I think that one of the things that is assumed here is something that we actually want to challenge, and that is that he's actually fully represented Darwinism. So we've noted that there is a kind of an open-endedness to Darwinism. This whole idea that there is an evolved human nature that somehow has now arrived means that we can, reaffirm conservative values like the drive to procreate or family life or what have you. He lists a number of different things, but is that actually so? I mean, I think the premise I think I'm pretty solid ground when I say this. I think the premise, not only of evolution but of sort of modern thought, is that there is nothing really that informs nature in any kind of normative sense or any kind of moral sense. Therefore, as the saying goes, all things are permitted. In other words, if you could pull off genocide, okay, if you can pull that off, and your particular group, acquires an advantage in terms of a particular environment and being able to control it and survive at the expense of another group, according to Darwinian, is sort of the way Darwinism works. There's no moral argument you can make against that, except maybe on the grounds that, we've lost a part of the gene pool, and maybe there's something there that would give us an advantage down the road that we've lost because we've wiped out that group of people over there. I'm not sure how you first of all, on Darwin's, sort of the terms of Darwinism, you say that is morally. I'm not saying that Darwinists would approve of what I just said. Sometimes I think people, I think erroneously jump from this is what Darwin would permit to saying this is what Darwinians would approve of. I think that many Darwinians, many sort of supporters of Darwinian evolution, actually would condemn things that Darwin's theory would permit, but they don't do it on the grounds of Darwinism.
What you're starting to see a lot of in this world that maybe at a couple generations ago would have been like the new atheist and even Dawkins. What you're starting to see them is that recognize that while they think the whole religion thing is nonsense, they now understand themselves as culturally influenced by Christianity. And of course, maybe they have their own, like this kind of interpretation of that. But one of the things they want to do is find that the values that they're seeing, with Islam and different places in the world are such that to them are so problematic, but on a strictly naturalistic interpretation, they can't argue for theirs being superior to the others because on that level, they're both expressions of nature unfolding, whatever its determination.
I can't remember where I heard this. I think I heard it attributed to Richard Dawkins. He more or less said, "I'm a Christian atheist."
It's like Douglas Murray too. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, the continental atheists accuse the British and Anglo-American atheists of being Christian atheists. That's been going on for years, but at least they're beginning to recognize it.
Right.
The interesting thing about this is if you look at someone like Jürgen Habermas, and premier public intellectual, kind of new left guy, he says explicitly that ideas like universal human rights and things like that originated only in a Judeo-Christian context. And he says, to say otherwise is, as he describes it, postmodern nonsense. However, he then makes the argument that, now that the Christians and Jews have come up with these ideas, as atheists, we can appropriate them, but we have to come up with our own reasons for them.
Yep. Cultural appropriation.
Which they haven't quite done yet.
Right.
All over the place going on there. And that's the, back to that point. If there is no transcendent source on which all things depend, then rationality and reason, there's no reason to trust their deliverances as anything other than aimed towards whatever survival issue is at hand in a particular context. It's not aimed at the true nature of things.
That's Plantinga's argument.
Yeah.
Plantinga it says basically if Darwinian evolution is correct, then the only thing that our brains are really designed for is survival. Yeah. And he uses the example of a guy named Paul. He says, now Paul encounters a tiger in the jungle. Paul runs away from the tiger and survives. Great. Now the question is, does it matter why he runs away from the tiger? Maybe he thinks seeing the tiger is the signal for the start of a foot race. Maybe he wants to pet the tiger, and knowing cats, decides the best way to get the tiger to let him pet him is to run away from it. He gives a whole host of absurd explanations, but the point he makes is it doesn't matter.
Right.
As long as he runs away,
Right.
he survives. And that's the only thing our brains are designed to do. So under these circumstances, how can you even trust rationality?
Yeah,
because all it is designed to do is to promote our survival.
Yeah, I've used this argument with people who are inclined to naturalism, and my statement is we are the most overcompensated creatures in the world, because there are things that we are interested in and things that we do that have very little to do with just simply sustaining our existences. Art. Now you can take visual art and maybe you can do something with it to say, along the lines of, some guys paint to impress women. So it's all about kind of a mating ritual kind of thing, or a way to get the girl. But if you were to ask the artist, what are you up to? That's not what he would say he's up to. And there are a lot of other people who would say there's more to it than that. So even if that plays a role in, explaining why some guys are artists, doesn't adequately, sort of exhaust at least the understanding of the person who's creating the art. And that, I think, is the thing that is most interesting about people. It's not just merely that we've figured out a lot of ways to inhabit environments that other creatures can't inhabit, but there's a lot more going on with human beings that makes them interesting. And so either we sort of reduce all that other stuff to survival, or we take it seriously and we say, okay, we're at least onto some things with this other stuff that we're into, and it's not just simply diversion, a sort of a ways to kind of keep ourselves occupied because we have nothing else to do. There's something about human beings that seem to be overcompensated if survival is the only thing that explains our presence in the world. Anyway, I think so we've talked a little bit about what is Darwinian conservatism, and we've pointed out some weaknesses at a pretty fundamental level with it. I think, too, it would be good to just quickly take a look at what he says is metaphysical conservatism, because I think he misrepresents it.
Yeah.
So he talks a little bit about Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk's a great guy. And he uses Russell Kirk as a kind of the epitome of the metaphysical conservative. And he says here, he's introducing, Hayek and contrasting Hayek with Kirk. But this is what he has to say about Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk stated the metaphysical and religious version of conservatism in his 1953 book, The Conservative Mind. The first canon of conservative thought, he declared, was, quote, belief that a divine intent rules society as well as conscience, forging an eternal chain of right and duty, which links great and obscure, living and dead, end of quote. That's a very Kirkian way of saying things, but anyway. Consequently, quote, politics is the art of apprehending and applying the justice which is above nature, end of quote. Now, that seems to sort of create this kind of antagonism between a metaphysical understanding of justice and the workings of nature. But that doesn't necessarily follow, and we've already talked a little bit about why. Of course, people like Kirk have been very critical of Darwinism. He quotes something that Kirk says about Darwinism. He says, those scientific theories or doctrines, Darwinism chief among them, which have done so much to undermine the first principles of a conservative order, end of quote. And that's just sort of an offhanded sort of parenthetical statement at the end of what probably is a paragraph. So it's sort of a throwaway, but it does express, I think, a conviction that many conservatives have, and that conviction is that Darwinism is not a friend of conservatism. And it's not because it undermines first principles, or at least is inconsistent with them, or has a difficult time being reconciled to them. Anyway, he goes on to talk about Hayek and the British empiricist tradition, people like Hume and Edmund Burke and so forth. But when it comes to this whole matter of sort of what would it mean for a society to be governed by a metaphysical understanding of right and wrong, he slips right into the theocratic, the idea that we're looking to set up some kind of, I don't know, theocracy that is just going to grind everybody into the dirt.
But I think that point in particular is first of all a red herring, a straw man. I mean, he's without arguing it. There is nothing whatsoever, if you have even an elementary understanding of the natural law tradition in classical theology, that a theocracy is it's actually the governing concepts and ideas that lead to things like individual rights and other things much further down the road. I think for him, if there is some infinite, all-determining source of all things that is the principal reality, then that means somehow that this reality is the only reality that human beings are to be in conformity to, not have relations with each other than or anything else, and therefore everything has to be basically theocratically organized. Being God-centered does not mean theocracy in these kind of domineering senses of the word. So, I don't get how he gets from teleology, metaphysics, classical metaphysics, or transcendent metaphysics to teleology to theocracy.
Yeah, he quotes Remy Bragg here, and that's I think a mistake on his part. Remy Bragg is misrepresented here because he just takes something out of context. I've read a number of things that Remy Bragg has written, and if the only thing that you knew that Remy Bragg had to say was what how he's presented here or represented here, you would not understand Remy Bragg. But anyway. He says here, if we want moral and political order guided by, quote, religiously informed cosmic teleology, end of quote, how do we avoid theocratic extremism? That's the rhetorical question, but it begs a lot of questions. And he goes on to say, not long ago, the Intercollegiate Review published an article by Remy Bragg with the title, Are Non-Theocratic Regimes Possible? End of quote. His answer to the question was no. His reasoning was that in the history of the Western world, the ultimate standard for order was the law of God. And even in modern liberal democracies, the appeal to individual conscience implies that this is somehow the voice of God implanted in human beings. He suggests that moral and political order is impossible without the theocratic appeal to the law of God as the metaphysical standard for all human action. Now, in one sense, I would say, yeah, I agree with Remy Bragg here, but the way this is crafted, the way this is sort of slanted or sort of inserted into the larger argument gives you the impression that, we've got some kind of, Remy Bragg supports some kind of Ayatollah, or...
Yeah, well, that was my point when he's using... The way he's using theocratic is, I think, in that sense, in the article.
Right.
Yeah.
And is that the way we should think about theocracies? Our friend Doug Wilson has defended theocratic libertarianism in the sense that he affirms human moral agency and human freedom within a political order, but at the same time there is a larger metaphysical understanding of the way the world works that informs government and how governments work with their citizens and how those governments justify their rule and even protect people who make choices that are out of accord with their own good and with the givens that they enjoy from God.
Yeah, and I think it in one very strong sense. I mean, again, he's right there. I mean, if God is the fundamental reality of all things, which he is, then there is a God from whom, through whom, and to whom are all things. So we're all in a theocratic universe as creatures, dependent on God for all we are, our sustenance, and to the culmination of our natures. I think the flip side of the coin, if there is no God, that's the terrifying thing. Or if this God is indifferent, those are terrifying. So it all depends on what one means by the nature of the one who is at the helm of all reality. And so let's put it this way. I am far more worried about an absolute conception of the state than I am some infinite benevolent source which is for the flourishing of the creation and it's enjoying him eternally, than I am a state that wants to force impose its will on us, all in the name of my own good.
Right.
Yeah. It again. We have to deal ultimately here with the character of God. The assumption is that if there is a God, he is not interested in liberty.
Yeah.
Right.
Just to be blunt about it. If there is a God, what he wants is drones.
Right.
Yeah.
He does not want independent beings who are acting creatively and making their own decisions within the boundaries of divine and natural law, in other words, liberty, and so on. What he's doing, as I think you said earlier, that he sees God, in this metaphysical conservatism, he sees God as being sort of the biggest thing in the universe.
The biggest will, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, God is just like any other totalitarian.
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah,
this is
that's an utterly invalid assumption when it comes to historic Christianity.
That's right. That's the shift from classic Christian conception of God and God's transcendent, from the shift in transcendent that led to a voluntaristic conception of God as basically the biggest tyrant around. So in order for us to increase, this deity must decrease. Where it's not even fathom the idea that this has to do with our very being itself. This isn't about a will imposing of the same order as my will, but just bigger. It's in him that we live and move and have our being, that we will and love and do all these things. We are in the order of creatures participating in the delight and donation of being, which gives us life and determines our ends towards enjoying God's perfection. But that is he thinks that is limiting us, when it is actually the way in which we are free to enact what we've been created to be for the enjoyment of God's plenitude, which is not limited by the creaturely. So it is the utmost freedom, because it's beyond the freedom of merely the temporal and this worldly. It's a freedom open to the transcendent and bliss itself, if you will.
Yeah, if you want a kind of a fictional sort of account, a story that kind of gives you some way of kind of getting into the sort of the frame of mind that we're criticizing here, mainly that we're just the people who say I'm an atheist, I can't believe in the God that I'm thinking about. Our response is, well, I wouldn't believe in the God you're thinking about either.
Yeah,
but if you're thinking about, where can you go to maybe see it presented, this sort of way of thinking presented in the form of a story, kind of like maybe, you see with Chronicles of Narnia with C.S. Lewis and theism, it would be Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials series. I remember when that first book in that series came out, I read it, was intrigued by it, was disturbed by certain undertones, and I kind of sensed where he was heading. But then when he got to book 2, and then finally with book 3, it was just obvious that the theism that he was attacking was a straw man. It doesn't actually exist in traditional Christianity anyway. But in that particular story, what you have is a being who is the first being who presumes that sort of presumes godhood because he's the first, and then everybody else who comes after him is in some sense enslaved by him, and now there's this kind of rebellion that's occurring in this world that Pullman describes. Well, obviously, if God really were just the first on the scene and wasn't the source of everything, then that would be a valid critique. But that's not the God that we worship or proclaim. So
That's right.
What Pullman and many naturalists attack when they describe the Christian faith is not actually the God of the Christian faith.
Yeah, they're thinking a being like other beings. They're not thinking being itself.
That's it,
So
being
which all
itself.
beings presuppose. And so
Right.
that's really their flaw. They don't understand that when we're talking about the great I am, we're talking about I amness.
Right.
We're talking about the plenitude of being in which anything that is must participate in order to be.
Right.
And there is, so you're either being itself, or if you have being, you're getting it from being itself. Right now, I am because of that being itself is God is. And this is why I am. I am not the infinite source of my life. I'm not the source of my life at this very moment. I don't, because I am not being. I participate in it as I am, but I'll also go out of it as I'm not. But being doesn't go in and out. It is the isness of anything that is, whether it's nature, thought. I used to always laugh. The metaphysical puzzle is that, nothing cannot be. Because if there is nothing, nothing itself would have to participate in being in order to not be, so I think Jonathan Edwards actually, he had an argument similar along those lines. But that's one of the things that, we start having to tell people, because it's been forgotten in the theistic language of the West, is that when we're talking, and when the church was talking historically about the nature of God, we're dealing with the plenitude of being, the infinite perfection of sheer delightful existence in all of its perfect fullness, has no lack in any sense of the word. And so that is the source of all things. Then the real question is, as I always say, is not, do we need God as a super explanation for everything else, but why is there anything else if God is perfectly sheer plenitude of being and doesn't need it in order to be? And I think that's the Christian answer of creation ex nihilo, and the delight God has in creating and in us sharing in relation to him in all things besides.
Yep. Everything is gift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, one of the
So you just done a version, of course, of the ontological argument.
right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this is a particularly important thing for the grumblers and other people who listen to the podcast to be kind of onto, because this kind of this approach that we see with Larry and Arnhart is something that comes up in different places. For example, there are a number of people in the manosphere who argue for the differences between men and women, and in a way that is intended to sort of justify traditional or conservative attitudes and practices with regard to the sexes, based on a Darwinian approach. There are problems with that. We can say, well, I'm glad you're on our team when it comes to these sexual differences. We can agree, to a degree, but when we come to how do we justify these things, and what are these things intended to, what ends are they intended to serve? Well, that's where we part company with those guys. And I think it's important for people who are looking for some sort of basis for their convictions about the differences between men and women and the importance of family life and so forth, not to get sucked into a Darwinian sort of a rationale for the things that they believe in or want to support.
That's it. Yeah, it's an important thing. I think you see. I mean, you all of a sudden you see as wokeism, a new kind of religion, kind of enters into the public domain. You do see people like new atheists like Sam Harris or Eric, I think Weinberg, and these different Darwinists starting to share many of the convictions that really are the outgrowth of Christianity, and they want to bring their expertise of showing how that there's a certain empirical grounding of things, like you said, sexual differences, the significance. Which, yes, I mean, I'm welcome to those insights as far as it goes. But that's as far as it goes, and they really, the minute they try to move that into dimensions beyond that is when I think they get much weaker, and they're not able to sustain those arguments, going on there. But I do think it's kind of it's an odd for people like myself who, back when I was going through school, the big debates that tended to happen, in the positivists during positivism was pretty much calling all of us theists a bunch of freaks and morons, and then all of a sudden they're defending, teleology and stuff like that, but just not. They just don't want to give honor where honor's due.
Well, it turns out that there are some of the new atheists who are saying, "Look, Christianity isn't true, but we need it."
Yeah, I've heard those.
Well, Neil Ferguson, Neil, and he's going to church. Yeah.
Maybe the kind of the silver lining to the dark cloud of wokeism is that some of these guys will discover that they can't have their cake and eat it too. They've got to really find a better basis for defending and promoting the things that they really believe in. Rationality, for example. What is the basis of rationality if everything is just simply, if everything can be reduced to power relationships? What can we say for rationality then? Rationality just becomes your way of sort of getting your way. It's just a way to kind of trick people into going along with what you want. There's no actual
it expands your entitlement.
Yeah, it doesn't really reflect reality. You're just looking out for yourself.
Yeah, and you also have the problem of free will. How does that fit in? Mm-hmm. I've run into atheists who basically argue that there's no such thing as free will, so you should decide to follow them.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. The forces of determinism haven't brought me to that point in my life, so I can't. Right.
Well, and that's the thing. They're determined to think the way they do. Ultimately, I mean, that's maybe they have come up with creative ways of showing that you can use kind of some kind of human rationality to persuade others to see things a different way. But in the end, it's all about survival value for them, and that begs the question till after the fact. I mean, how do you know? You can think with all your best past, experience that something is good, and it turns out to be not good for the next set of circumstances, and you can't know till after the fact. I mean, that's the thing. And I get, I get this turn to the empirical because it is an important dimension that if we just move towards philosophical arguments. I mean, this was the point, and this is why I think in the article you hear him. He wants to move away from Plato, and he wants to emphasize Aristotle and Thomas because they would at least be hold to. But I think he has Plato fundamentally wrong, and I don't think that Aristotle I think Aristotle was developing a lot of Plato and took things his direction, and Thomas was appreciative of both. So I think he was very confused, I think, in a lot of positions. One last point while it's on my mind, but there's a lot of attraction to figures like Jordan Peterson, especially because he holds a lot of principles that really do push up against the these movements that are kind of move us away from the empirical and classic Christianity. And one of the things that makes him attractive is he has space and room with his Jungian, approach for archetypes that what he would see a doctrine more as an archetype that's way back in our Darwinian development that is something that is more than just is more than just kind of arbitrary. I mean, is significant, but that stuff gets fuzzy and shady too. But a lot of Christians kind of run right to it. Actually, I believe out of the Catholic world, there just came a book theologically engaging positives and negatives in his. I haven't reviewed it yet, but I'd be curious to do, because I do know there's a lot of people out in our listening audience who have found a lot of value in Peterson, but not to run so much with all of those ideas, because I think they do fundamentally sever off a proper Christian view of transcendence and then getting the immanence the right way.
Yeah, we've had a few people encourage us to try to get Peterson on the show, and I have never done anything with that. But the more I think about it, the more I think it would be a worthwhile thing to do. I think that we could have a good conversation with him, and I think that he would find us worth his time. At least I hope he would. Anyway, we should wrap up. Speaking of time, we should wrap up. We've gotten to that time. Anyway, anything you want to say, Glenn, as we wrap up?
No, I think I said everything I need to for this time.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for listening to Theology Pugcast. We really do appreciate the people who support us. There are people out there that actually send us money every month. It's just amazing. And we're glad for those folks. If you want to join them, there are different places you can do that. You can do that through the Fight, Laugh, Feast network, and that's a great way to do it. And I even think that there are other ways to do it, and we're glad for that. You can go directly to our website, make a donation there. You can go to Anchor FM, do something there. We've got a few people who give to us regularly there. All that's great, and we're very glad for it. Also, folks, give us good ratings. I mean, we've got a number of good ratings in a number of platforms, and we're very glad for that. And when you do that, we're told by the people who are in the know that helps in terms of getting the word out about the show. So thank you to those who've done that already. And if you've been thinking you'd like to do that, well, why delay any longer? Do it today. Go right online and give us 5 stars or 25 camels or whatever it is that they use to measure goodness on your platform. Anyway, well, that's it for now. Thanks a lot for listening to the podcast. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.